Okay, we are recording. Hello and welcome to the show that has no name because this is not a Q&A video. Also, it's not an aquarium studies video, although I'm going to be coming up with aquarium studies number 3 probably within the next 2 days. And it'll be discussing the fascinating topic of changes in the ecology of that tank back there, changes in the ecosystem as a result of adding new species. So you've got that to look forward to. But in this video, I'm going to be talking about something more Buddhism oriented, although it's not going to be Theravada. It's going to be Zen Koans. And I actually have some notes here, just so it won't be as rambling and at random as a lot of my discussions are. So I'm starting off with the intro, which is what I'm doing right now. This is the intro. And I've always had an interest in Zen Koans, largely because I've always had a liking for disorientation. I remember one time I was walking through a forest in Burma at a forest monastery, and I got like this little insight, this little secular kind of insight, in that it helped me to understand certain things about myself, in that I've always liked sort of an off-the-wall, sort of abstract, absurd kind of humor, like Monty Python. I've always liked certain intoxicants which cause a kind of heightened awareness, but at the same time disorientation in a sense, like things make less sense when you're looking at them. Also, I've always had a liking for strange, disorienting kind of like experimental music. And it just kind of dawned on me that I thrive on disorientation, and Zen Koans are like a device, a tool for cultivating disorientation. What a Zen Koan is it's a kind of riddle that does not have a correct answer, but even so, you are required to answer it correctly. And so in Zen Buddhism, especially Rinzai Zen, you're given a koan, which is this riddle, and it may be several times a day you are summoned to the Zen master, to the Roshi, and required to answer the riddle. And back in the old days, a lot of the time, if you answered it wrong, you'd be hit by a stick, as is the case in many koans themselves. It's a kind of story that you're supposed to interpret, and there's a lot of getting beaten with sticks in these koans. Every single koan that involves the Zen monk Rinzai, who became the founder of the Rinzai sect of Zen Buddhism in Japan, every single story I've ever read about Rinzai, he's hitting somebody. But you can say that Zen Buddhism is not Theravadan, but there are sort of proto-koans, like early sort of semi-koans, quasi-koans that can be found in the earliest Buddhist texts. For example, in the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata. And I'll read a couple of verses from the Atthakavagga that, I mean, if you think about them, they do seem pretty koan-like. So I just happen to have the book right here. That's convenient. And the first verse, which I've read many times before in my videos, is from the Magandiya Sutta. And it's verse 5 of the Magandiya Sutta of the Atthakavagga of the Sutta Nipata. And it is as follows: not by what is viewed, not by what is heard, not by inner knowledge, Magandiya, said the Blessed One, nor by morality and observances is purity said to be. By absence of what is viewed, by absence of what is heard, by non-knowledge, by immorality, by non-observance, also not by that. So having let go of these, not taking hold of anything, a peaceful one, not being dependent, would not have longings for existence. So it's the Buddha saying, how you attain purity, which here is like a metaphor or a manner of speaking for enlightenment. And he pretty much rules out all possibilities. So that's sort of koan-like. I think the next one is even more koan-like. And this is from the Kalaha Vivada Sutta. And this also is describing the enlightened mind. And it's verse 13. as follows. He has no perception of perception. He has no perception of non-perception. He is not without perception. He has no perception of void. For one who has attained thus, form becomes void. For founded in perception is diversifying designation. So again, it's like the enlightened mind is possible, but yet it seems like every single possibility is ruled out. So when you rule out all possibilities, how do you become enlightened? Or what is the enlightened mind like when it isn't like any of the possibilities? So that's fairly koan-like. But in Zen Buddhism, especially Rinzai Zen, they made it into, it's like an established practice you're trying to come up with the answer to this koan. You have to, or you're going to get beaten by the stick again. So you're just like racking your brains trying to come up with an answer until finally it's like your intellect just breaks. Your thinking mind just hits the wall or whatever it is, it throws a rod, whatever it is, and just stops. And when your mind stops, you have like this flash of silence and clarity that contains the answer. And then you go and answer the koan to the Roshi, and there's a good chance he will accept your answer if it is inspired, regardless of what the answer is, if it is inspired by this flash of clarity that is caused by your mind just breaking temporarily and causing like this moment of silence and expanded awareness, which contains all knowledge, essentially, at least in potential. So I'm going to read a few of my favorite koans, or the first one maybe is not one of my favorites, but it's a famous one. I mean, the most famous, of course, is what is the sound of one hand clapping? That's, if anyone can think of a koan, generally that's the one they can think of, especially if they're not really into Zen. I mean, if they're more into Zen, it might be like Joshu's Mu, does a dog have Buddha nature, that kind of thing. But I'm just going to, let's see here, read a few of my faves, plus one kind of famous one. And mainly it's coming from this book that I got back when I was a monk. My father let me order some books from Amazon, and so I ordered this one, just mainly because I wanted a copy of the Heikigan Roku, or the Blue Cliff Record, which is probably the second most famous collection of koans after the Mumonkan, or the No Gate Barrier. It translates as something like No Gate Barrier. So anyways, let's see here. This is the famous one. And it kind of explains the origins of Zen. It explains how Mahakassapa or Kashyapa became the first patriarch of Zen. And it's case number 6. And in this translation by Katsuki Sekida, it's called The Buddha Holds Out a Flower. So here's the koan. When Shakyamuni Buddha was at Mount Gurjakuta, or Vulture's Peak, he held out a flower to his listeners. Everyone was silent. Only Mahakashyapa broke into a broad smile. The Buddha said, "I have the true Dharma eye, the marvelous mind of nirvana, the true form of the formless, and the subtle Dharma gate, independent of words and transmitted beyond doctrine. This I have entrusted to Mahakashyapa." So, this is supposedly the origin of Zen Buddhism, where instead of giving a Dhamma talk, a sermon, as the Buddha usually did, one day he just sat in front of everybody, held up a flower, and was just sort of twirling the flower between his thumb and forefinger. And none of the monks got it, except Mahakassapa. In Pali, it's Mahakassapa. In Sanskrit, it's Mahakashyapa. And Mahakashyapa smiled, because he got it. And so what is it that he got? That's pretty much what the koan is. Although, according to Mumon, in the Mumonkan, he's got a comment here. Golden-faced Gautama really disregarded his listeners. He made the good look bad and sold dog's meat labeled as mutton. He himself thought it was wonderful. If, however, everyone in the audience had laughed, how could he have transmitted his true I? And again, if Mahakashyapa had not smiled, how could the Buddha have transmitted it? If you say the true eye of Dharma can be transmitted, then the golden-faced old man would be a city slicker who cheats the country bumpkin. If you say it cannot be transmitted, then why did the Buddha approve of Mahakashyapa? So that's sort of the koan also, not just getting the twirling flower. There's different ways you can interpret the koan, or different angles, different koans you can milk out of the same story. But also it's like, how is Zen transmitted? How is the Dharma eye transmitted from teacher to student? Just by twirling a flower and somebody gets it, it's sort of, presumably it inspired a flash of insight in Mahakashyapa, although presumably he was already enlightened anyway, so he didn't really need any flashes of insight in particular, at least not for the sake of becoming enlightened. So Mumon's verse, in the Mumon Kan, you have the koan, then you have like this little commentary, which is also like a koan. The Buddha, sometimes Mumon just says like the opposite of what he means. Like, he's referring to the Buddha as being a kind of con man, essentially, which I'll get to that a little later. There's another koan that's one of my favorites that has that as a theme. Just sort of like the con of Dharma in general, which is a kind of koan. But also, in addition to the comment, Mumon also has a verse, which in the translations don't have meter or rhyme. But anyways, Mumon's verse to this one is, holding out a flower, the Buddha betrayed his curly tail. Heaven and earth were bewildered at Mahakashyapa's smile. So presumably, why did he smile is a kind of a koan. How did like the Zen get transmitted from teacher to student and cause Mahakashyapa to become the first Zen patriarch? That's another koan that you could read into the story. And my purpose here is not to try to answer these koans, because, as I've already mentioned, koans really do not have a correct answer. It depends on your mental state when you're speaking it, and to someone who isn't a Zen master, it wouldn't make sense anyway. So that's the first one. Let's see what the second one is here. Okay, this is one of my all-time favorites, and it's translated very differently by the two different translators that I've come across. I'll read this one from this book, but I much prefer the translation of Nyogen Senzaki, whose version is found in the book Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. And I suppose I could have gotten the book out of the bookcase in the other room, but it's not necessary. We'll just go with this one. But the thing with Nyogen Senzaki, he himself was apparently a Zen master. And so his translations of these koans are not literal. He'll translate it very loosely, as you'll see with regard to this koan that I'm about to read. And in a way, it's like he's taking artistic license for the sake of transmitting the koan from one language to the next so that it has largely the same effect. And I think he really does well in that regard, because apparently he really did get Zen and also get koans. So anyways, this koan is case 15 of the Mumon Kan. And the literal translation is Tozan's 60 blows. So Tozan came to study with Umon. Umon asked, "Where are you from?" "From Sato," Tozan replied. "Where were you during the summer?" That's the rains retreat, and they translated it as summer. "Where were you during the summer?" "Well, I was at the monastery of Hozu, south of the lake." "Where did you leave there?" Or when did you leave there? Umon asked. "On August 25th, was Tozan's reply. "I spare you 60 blows, Umon said. The next day, Tozan came to Umon and said, "Yesterday you said you spared me 60 blows. I beg to ask you, where was I at fault?" "Oh, you rice bag," shouted Umon. "What makes you wander about, now west of the river, now south of the lake?" Tozan thereupon came to a mighty enlightenment experience. So, the question is, the koan is presumably, why or how did Tozan come to a mighty enlightenment experience? And it can help if you go with Nyogen Senzaki's translation, where for some reason I don't fully understand, Senzaki reduced the number of blows to only 3. So I spare you 3 blows instead of 60. And then when Tozan asks, I beg to ask you, where was I at fault? The essence of what Umon was yelling was, oh, you are good for nothing. You just wander around from one place to another. And this shouting denunciation, essentially, Tozan had a kind of, I don't know if he became fully enlightened, but he had like an awakening experience. And that's kind of the con man theme again. It's like, in a way, it's true that in a way, a monk is kind of good for nothing and just wanders around from one place to another. So you can interpret that like a light side and a dark side. And in Zen Koans, and for example, with Mumon, who's the commentator, he'll take the dark side. He'll interpret it negatively. And the negative interpretation is just as true as the positive interpretation, which is itself a kind of koan. That in a way, a monk is like a noble hero if he's a conscientious monk. But at the same time, he's kind of good for nothing and just wanders around from one place to another like a hobo. So that's another kind of koan that I kind of get that one. Some koans, they're just so weird, you know, just so completely out of left field, so completely off the wall that you just don't get it at all. It's like, I mean, how could you possibly answer it? But this one, you know, you can kind of almost grasp it. You know, it's the simile that I've given before. I shouldn't do it, but I'm going to do it anyway. It's like when you're like picking your nose and you got kind of this booger that you can kind of get the tip of your fingernail on, but you just can't really get it out. That's kind of like this koan for me. It's like you can almost kind of grasp it, but not quite. So, with that edifying little speech, I'm going to move on to the next one. And this one's kind of a famous one too, because it involves Bodhidharma, who is the patriarch of Zen, who brought Zen Buddhism from India to China. You know, as most historians of or students of Buddhism know, Mahayana Buddhism originally arose in India, and then it spread through Central Asia, through like the trade routes, the caravan routes into China. And then in its homeland of India, not only Mahayana, but all schools of Buddhism were pretty much wiped out, especially when the Muslim Turks invaded, but we don't need to get into that. And also it was wiped out in most of Central Asia also. But Bodhidharma is the one who is considered to have brought Zen or jhana Buddhism, because Zen itself is a corruption of the Chinese word Chan, which itself is a corruption of the Sanskrit word jhana, which means meditation. So it's the meditation school. So anyways, here's case 41 of the Mumon Kan, Bodhidharma's mind pacifying. Bodhidharma sat facing the wall. The second patriarch stood in the snow. He cut off his arm and presented it to Bodhidharma, crying, "My mind has no peace as yet. I beg you, master, please pacify my mind." "Bring your mind here, and I will pacify it for you," replied Bodhidharma. "I have searched for my mind, and I cannot take hold of it," said the second patriarch. "Now your mind is pacified," said Bodhidharma. So this is a famous story where the second patriarch, Bodhidharma, is the first patriarch of Chinese Zen Buddhism or Chan Buddhism. There were a number of Indian patriarchs before him, with Mahakashyapa being the first one, unless you want to include the Buddha himself as the first patriarch. So Bodhidharma was the first one in China. And so the second patriarch, according to the story, cut off his own arm, just in like desperation, I guess. Because Bodhidharma was a hard ass. He sat staring at a wall for years. In fact, there are some stories that he actually cut off his own eyelids so that he couldn't close his eyes. And that's one reason why, if you see like old Zen pictures, like pen and ink drawings of Bodhidharma, he's got like these great big staring eyes because he apparently, or according to tradition at least, cut off his own eyelids just so he would not indulge in sleepiness. So, I mean, that's the koan here is, I mean, I've searched for my mind and I cannot take hold of it. Now your mind is pacified. And I suppose I could try to explain that to some degree, but that kind of wrecks the koan, doesn't it? You can stew over it yourself. And I'll just move on to the next and last koan that I'm really going to read. And this is from the Heikigan Roku. And the Heikigan Roku, it's more off the wall even than the Mumon Kan. In a way, it's more abstract. You can tell that the editor and commentator to the Heikigan Roku had a different personality than Mumon, who was the editor and commentator of the Mumon Kan. And so in the Heikigan Roku as it exists today, let's see, you've got an introduction by a Zen monk named Engo, and then you've got the main subject, and then you've got a verse by a different Zen master named Secho. So this is case 75 of the Heikigan Roku, and it's called Ukyu's Unfair Blows, and it involves monks that really are not well known. There's a mention of Joshu in the koan, but it's not even the famous Joshu, it's a different Joshu. So anyways, the main subject, well, I guess I might as well read the commentary, the comments in the verse at the end. So Engo's introduction is, the sacred sword is ever in hand. It is death-dealing and life-giving. It is there, it is here, simultaneously giving and taking. If you want to hold fast, you are free to hold fast. If you want to let go, you are free to let go. Tell me how it will be when one makes no distinction between host and guest and is indifferent to which role one takes up. See the following. And so what follows is the main subject. A monk came from Joshu Osho's assembly to Ukyu, who said to him, "What do you find in Joshu's teaching? Is there anything different from what you find here?" The monk said, "Nothing different." Ukyu said, "If there is nothing different, why don't you go back there?" And he hit him with his stick. The monk said, "If your stick had eyes to see, you would not strike me like that." Ukyu said, "Today I have come across a monk," and he gave him 3 more blows. The monk went out. Ukyu called after him and said, "One may receive unfair blows." The monk turned back and said, "To my regret, the stick is in your hand." Ukyu said, "If you need it, I will let you have it." The monk went up to Ukyu, seized his stick, and gave him 3 blows with it. Ukyu said, "Unfair blows! Unfair blows!" The monk said, "One may receive them." Ukyu said, "I hit this one too casually." The monk made bows. Ukyu said, "Osho, is that how you take leave?" The monk laughed aloud and went out. Ukyu said, "It can be like this. It can be like this." And that's the koan. You have to interpret that koan. And when it's mentioning Osho here, it's not, of course, referring to the Bhagwan Rajneesh. Osho is just an honorific title for a Zen master, generally like an abbot. So Ukyu was not only letting this visitor monk beat on him with a stick, but he was calling him the master, which is just a kind of total confusion of like traditional roles, which is part of the koan. So anyway, Secho's verse at the end. Easy to cull the snakes, hard to scatter them. How splendidly they crossed swords. Although the sea is deep, it can be drained. The kalpa stone is hard, but wears away. Old Ukyu, who is there like you, to give the stick to another that was truly thoughtless? And again, it's using like negative terms as a kind of praise, which is part of the Zen koan motif of like adopting the dark side, which is just as true as the light side. You know, so something is truly thoughtless. I mean, you can say it's stupid, but at the same time, without thought is really what you're trying for. That's what causes the silence and the insight to arise. So before I tell one last story, I'm going to go back to the Mumonkan, but I'm going to do Nyogen Senzaki's translation. I have this little notebook that I've had for many years, and I've used it, especially when I was a monk, to write down stuff that I would see that I really liked in books that were not mine, so that I could sort of record it and keep it. So it's like a book of quotes that I really liked. And one of them is from the Mumonkan, but it's Nyogen Senzaki's translation from Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. It's not from Two Zen Classics. And I had somebody send it to me through the mail. This is back before email, when I was living in Burma. And let's see, it's case 19 of the Mumonkan. So it involves two of the most famous Zen masters of medieval China, Joshu and Nansen, even though Joshu and Nansen are Japanese names because generally Americans get their Zen from Japan rather than from China. So anyways, Joshu asked Nansen, "What is the path?" Nansen said, "Everyday life is the path." Joshu asked, "Can it be studied?" Nansen said, "If you try to study it, you will be far away from it." Joshu asked, "If I do not study, how can I know it is the path?" Nansen said, "The path does not belong to the perception world, neither does it belong to the non-perception world. Cognition is a delusion and non-cognition is senseless. If you want to reach the true path beyond doubt, place yourself in the same freedom as sky. You name it neither good nor not good." At these words, Joshu was enlightened. And that kind of statement where you're ruling out all possibilities, cognition and non-cognition, for example, I mean, it goes right back to the Atthakavagga, like some of the texts that get closest chronologically to Gautama Buddha himself. I mean, a lot of these koans, like the one about the Buddha twirling a flower, there's no mention of that in the oldest texts. And the Buddha's boasting at the end of the koan kind of indicates that it's sort of an anachronism that a lot of kind of devotionalism had already crept into Buddhism by the time that such words were attributed to be coming out of the Buddha's mouth. Because, frankly, I am skeptical of the Buddha indulging in grandiose boasting about himself. But that's not really the point of this video. And so I'll just conclude this video with a little story that Ram Dass used to tell. How Ram Dass, who was a famous Dharma teacher in the West, one of the most famous back in like the 70s and 80s, he got invited to a session or Zen meditation retreat, and it was especially for heavy hitters. You know, this was like an advanced level meditation retreat. And so he goes there and he meets this guy with a clipboard who's like, "Das, Ram, cabin 6. And he's not treated like a celebrity. He's just treated like a rookie, like a trainee or something. And it turned out that partly because this was for heavy hitters, or like an advanced meditation retreat, it was just a grueling meditation regime where you'd have to sit in perfect form in just, like 20 hours a day, very little sleep. And if you did not sit in perfect form, they used the traditional old-fashioned way of one of the Zen monks, who I think is called the Jiki Jitsu, who's the guy with the stick. Not the Roshi, who has the little stick. This one has the bigger stick. And if your posture is not good, like you're slumping over or something, then he'll whack you across the shoulders with this stick. And then, you bow to him and he bows to you, and then you go on your way. In fact, some monks that are really having trouble with being too sleepy might actually raise their hand and request getting beaten by the stick. So anyways, Ram Dass is at this retreat, and it's not going well. He's the koan that he had to answer is, "How do you know your Buddha nature from the sound of a chirping cricket?" And so several times a day, every few hours, he'd have to go to the Roshi. And then the Roshi would say, "Ram Dass, how do you know your Buddha nature from the sound of a chirping cricket?" And Ram Dass like when he's sitting in meditation, like working on the koan, he'd be trying to come up with, answers. So one time, when he gets asked, how do you know your Buddha nature from the sound of a chirping cricket? Ram Dass just goes like, and the Roshi just says like 20%, go back and meditate some more. So Ram Dass is starting to get really frustrated. In fact, he starts like hiding out in the bathroom. And it turned out that so many people were hiding out in the bathroom that they have to send in the Jiki Jitsu or some other monk to like drive them back out into the meditation hall so that they'd be meditating again. And it was just getting very frustrating. He'd go and give some lame answer to the Roshi, and the Roshi starts like acting disappointed. Like, we had high hopes for you, Ram Dass, but really it may be that you're just not cut out to be a Zen monk. And so Ram Dass, he's like trying to come up with ways of just getting called away on an emergency or something, some way of leaving early without completely losing face and disgracing himself. So finally one day he just figures, what the hell? This is just too much. I just give up. Let them kick me out. I don't give a damn. And so he's walking towards the Roshi for his next interview. And he said that at the same time that he had this, I give up, I don't give a shit attitude, everything is just brighter than usual. Everything's like crystal clear. And so he goes and sits down in front of the Roshi, and the Roshi says, Ram Dass, how do you know your Buddha nature from the sound of a chirping cricket? And Ram Dass just says, good morning, Roshi. And then the Roshi's face just lit up. He just goes, Ram Dass, I think you are becoming a beginning student of Zen. And that's how the story ends. And as you can see, it's not logical. It's not rational. It's not objective. It's not even really irrational. That's part of the paradox. You can't rely on emotionality either. You can't rely on subjectivity. You can't really rely on anything when you come up with these answers other than just a kind of clarity, which presumably is induced by just breaking your brain against this riddle that has no answer. So, if you're really into disorientation or paradoxes, or reading things that are very simple in a way, but just don't make sense, then Zen Koans may be for you. And it can be a legitimate spiritual path. It's not emphasized in Theravada, obviously, other than a few koan like passages you can find. But still, it was Zen Buddhism, and especially Rinzai Zen, that turned it into like an important aspect of spiritual practice. And I'm not sure if there are any other spiritual systems that really rely on trying to make sense of what doesn't make sense, insisting upon it until your mind just breaks, and then it produces this silence and clarity from which insight can arise. So that's my little video on the Zen Koans. And probably next time I'll get back to Theravada, or maybe even pre-Theravada and really early stuff. But I've got some free time on my hands last few weeks, and so I figure, what the hell. So I guess the last thing to say in this video is be happy.